We appreciate having each of you with us today. Those who are visiting with us, we especially appreciate you and look forward to having you with us again. Today I want to talk about a subject that is very seldom ever spoken about, because for most people it is the most unpleasant subject in the Bible. But by the same token, it is one of the most plentifully spoken about things in the Bible. And as you see from your handout, we're talking about giving. But I want you to understand, as we get involved in this, we've got some remarks I want to make before you form an opinion about where we're going today. In 2 Corinthians, the 8th chapter and verse 12, with whatever contributions you have, since you are willing to do this, remember that people are accepted if they give what they are able to give. God doesn't ask for what they don't have. What we need to realize and recognize is that in spite of all of the comments that are made in the scriptures about the process of giving, and there's giving in a variety of different ways, that what's being spoken about is, as Paul refers to it here in the 2 Corinthians letter, that it's based on what an individual has. We often go on the basis of, we put a amount of the contribution on the board, but that's not really what's important. What's really important is the motivation behind it. And as we will see, God doesn't necessarily look at the amount as much as he looks at the percentage of it. And it might seem a little strange that it would be that way, but we're going to find that, particularly in today's lesson in dealing with the old covenant, that this is not something that is new. This is something that has always been the case with God since the very first people on this planet. And so we need to recognize and realize that God is looking at us from a percentage standpoint rather than a dollar and cent standpoint. And so we need to be careful and think about it. And as we look at this, we're going to talk, first of all, we make mention of the fact and give you an idea about the amount of time, number of times that this is mentioned. In the New Testament, just in the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew 33 times, Mark 20, Luke 53, John 17. And that's just in the first 4 books of the Bible. There are well over 150 mentions of it in the New Testament alone. Every single book in the New Testament, even those like Jude that consist of only 1 chapter, mentions giving. So you might come to the conclusion that this must be a rather important subject as far as God is concerned, because he spends that much time with it, far more than he talks about prayer, than he talks about baptism, he talks about salvation. So it's a subject that, as we say, is very seldom spoken about, because as I was preparing for this lesson, I was reading the comments made by one preacher who preached on this particular topic, and after he was finished, they fired him. And because this is very often considered to be the one subject that you leave alone if you're preaching. Don't talk about this subject at all. But it's one that's in the scriptures, and so it needs to be spoken about, because we need to understand it. In Genesis, the 4th chapter, in verses 3 through 5, later Cain brought some crops from the land as an offering to the Lord. Abel also brought some choice parts of the firstborn animals from his flock. The Lord approved of Abel and his offering, but he didn't approve of Cain and his offering. So Cain became very angry and was disappointed. This is another one of the accounts of the scriptures that's very seldom understood. Most of the time it's looked at from the standpoint that Cain brought a sacrifice that was from his crops, and that Abel brought a sacrifice that was a lamb or an animal sacrifice. And the individuals usually speaking about this say that, well, Cain should have brought an animal sacrifice as opposed to bringing a grain sacrifice. But later on in the law of Moses, you see that this is not the case, that God accepted grain sacrifices as well as he did animal sacrifices. But if we really want to know what the real problem was with what was given, we have to go to the 11th chapter of the Hebrew letter in the 4th verse. Faith led Abel to offer God a better sacrifice than Cain's sacrifice. Through his faith, Abel received God's approval, since God accepted his sacrifices. Notice, sacrifices, plural. Through his faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. If we read the scriptures carefully, what we discover is, it would appear that Cain brought a sacrifice that was just whatever he happened to have available of the crops that he had grown. He just brought that. But what Abel brought was not only a lamb or a sacrifice of this nature, one of the firstborn, as it's spoken of here. So it was first quality, and that's emphasized. And in addition to that, he brought a second sacrifice as well. And this appears to be where the real problem was. Cain sort of haphazardly went about offering what he did, but Abel offered his sacrifice in the plural according to what God had commanded. And individuals will say, well, we can't really know that, but look at 1 John 3:12. Don't be like Cain. He was a child of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did Cain murder his brother? Because the things Cain did were evil, and the things his brother did had God's approval. So there was God's approval on what Abel did, as we would understand. But again, the answer to this, as to what took place, is not spoken of or mentioned to us in the Old Testament. But in the 4th chapter of the Roman letter, the Apostle Paul tells us this: the laws in Moses' teachings bring about anger, but where laws don't exist, they can't be broken. So what this tells us is very clearly that even though we do not have mention of it in the book of Genesis in regard to what was required of an individual to offer sacrifices to God, there was a law. God had declared what he wanted. Cain did not comply with what God asked for. Abel did. And so the end result was that the offering that Abel made was acceptable. And Cain was angry because he basically took the attitude that a lot of people do. Well, I'm going to give what I want to, and that'll be good enough. It doesn't matter what God has asked for. I'll just do what I decide to do. And the end result was not too good. Of course, he killed his brother and ended up having to go to live in the land of Nod, and was considered to be a marked man. In fact, God had to promise him that he wouldn't be killed because it was known what he had done. But nevertheless, as we look at this and think about it, we have to recognize once again that God does not leave us in the dark about what he wants from us. He tells us clearly what he expects. Now, he didn't necessarily put every identical item or every specific item in the scriptures for us. Just like in this particular instance, we don't know exactly what God's requirements were that he gave to Cain and Abel and to the others of that time, but it is evident that there was a requirement, and Cain failed to make the cut, so to speak, in that he did things his way as opposed to God's way. And that, of course, has always been a point of difficulty for mankind. Again in Genesis, this time the 14th chapter, he blessed Abraham and said, "Blessed is Abraham by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. Blessed is the God Most High, who has handed your enemies over to you." Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now this is talking about Melchizedek. He was a priest, obviously one that was approved by God because Abraham sacrificed to him. And as a result of the actions that Abraham had taken at this particular point in time, he had a considerable amount of goods. And yet for Melchizedek, he offered to God through him 10% of what he had. This is where tithing originates as far as the scriptures are concerned. But what's important to notice about this is that this is 500 years before the law of Moses. So before there was ever any commandments given about giving from the standpoint of the Mosaic law, here it has been established that God expected this much of an individual like Abraham to be acceptable to him. So that's why I said at the outset that God is more interested in looking at percentages than he is at dollars and cents. If you think about the widow who put what she had into the offering, and we are told by Jesus that it was only a tenth of a cent, but it was all she had, and he said she gave more than those that had put in much more, dollars and cents wise, but what she gave was all she had. So she gave far more than they did, because again, you're looking at the percentage, not at the dollar and cents amount. Everything belongs to God in the first place. So all you're doing is giving back to him a portion of what he has permitted you to have, of what is his. And so he's very interested in you being a good steward about what you have to deal with. And as we see, we have the example here of Abraham and the way in which he did this. And you might say that this basically, from the standpoint of the Old Testament, establishes sort of a baseline, I guess you would say, a tenth of whatever the individual had. And this was approved by God. But then in addition to this, another example in the book of Genesis, in the 28th chapter, beginning in verse 20, then Jacob made a vow, if God will be with me and will watch over me on my trip and give me food to eat and clothes to wear, and if I return safely to my father's home, then the Lord will be my God. This stone that I have set up as a marker will be the house of God, and I will surely give you a tenth of everything you give me. So here is another example of one of the patriarchs from the Old Testament, Jacob in this particular instance. And this is the spot where he had spent the night with his head on a rock and had seen the ladder with angels coming up and down. And he recognized that God was, this was a point of contact, you might say, with God. But the important thing to notice is that Jacob at this time did not even have food to eat, and just perhaps the clothes on his back. And so he makes this promise to God that whatever you give to me, I will give you 10% of that. Here again, an example of tithing in the Old Testament. This time, way back. So what we have to recognize again, as I've said before, is we're talking percentages. We're not talking dollars and cents. So here is a man that when he was, we might say, dead broke, he promised to give 10%, and then as he prospered, and he prospered greatly, he continued to give on that basis to the Lord because he had God's approval. So unfortunately, not too many people seem to understand the real ideas that are presented about giving as far as the scriptures are concerned. We get so involved in talking about how much that we fail to see what God is really looking for. And so it doesn't really matter if you've got $1 million on the board if 10% was $2 million, because the bottom line is it's not what God expects. And so we have to recognize and we have to realize in our own lives, and the Lord willing, next week I'll talk about things from the New Testament in regard to this. Next is 22, 29 through 30. Never withhold your best wine from me. You must give me your firstborn son. You must do the same with your cattle and your sheep. They will stay with their mothers 7 days, but on the 8th day you must give them to me. Now this is God speaking, and he even goes to the point of saying, what you have belongs to me. Even your firstborn animals, your firstborn son belongs to me. And you have to buy him back from me. You have to pay the price to have this child. And again, I don't think too many people understand this or recognize it. In Numbers 3, the next reference you have there are 273 more firstborn male Israelites than there are Levites. It will cost you 2 ounces of silver per person, using the standard weight of the holy place, to buy them back. Give the silver to Aaron and his sons. It will buy back those Israelites who outnumber the Levites. At this particular time, a census was being taken of the Israelites, and the total number of newborns in the nation of Israel was 20,273, or 22,000, excuse me. The bottom line was that you subtracted the number of Levites in the tribe of Israel from the number of firstborns, and the difference was 273. And so those 273 children had to be redeemed from the Lord at the price of 2 ounces of silver apiece. So again, talking about the Lord considers everything His. And I don't think, too often people think about, well, this is mine. It's not yours. It's just loaned to you, whatever you have. There isn't anything that you have that you produced actually yourself, if you want to stop and think about it. Because the intelligence that you have that caused you to be able to make a living and to produce the items and things of this nature, that came from God. You didn't have anything to do with how much intelligence you have. You didn't do that. He gave you the ability to learn a trade, to learn to do whatever it is you do. So God views it from the standpoint that it all belongs to me. How much of it are you entitled to keep for your own particular usage? And this is where we have to recognize the relationship that has to exist between what we provide for God and what He provides for us. In Exodus 13:2, set apart every firstborn male for me. Every firstborn male offspring among the Israelites is mine, whether human or animal. And so, once again, God says, they belong to me. And He sets forth in the Scriptures what is going to have to be paid in order to redeem them, to get them back, so that they will be yours and you'll be able to use them. And again, I say, we don't really think about the fact that the Israelites had to redeem their children from God. This is, of course, changed from the New Testament standpoint, but the reality is that we have a responsibility toward God for everything that we have, for every blessing that we enjoy. In Exodus 13, again, when Pharaoh was too stubborn to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn male in Egypt, human and animal. This is why we sacrifice every firstborn male to the Lord and buy every firstborn son back from the Lord. So again, you have the example set forth here of why exactly it was that God chose to have the Israelites to redeem their children. Part of it, I'm confident, was a reminder to them of the benefits that they had received as a result of what God had done for them in the land of Egypt in dealing with Pharaoh and being able to have him to release them and come back. And your final reference there in Numbers 18, every firstborn male, human or animal, that is brought to the Lord is yours. But you must buy back every firstborn son and every firstborn male of any unclean animal. When they are 1 month old, you must buy them back at the fixed price of 2 ounces of silver using the standard weight of the holy place. And so God set a specific price that was to be offered for these individuals. So as we look at this and as you think about it, I want you to realize that, again, that we look at the contribution and all from the wrong standpoint. And the only way that it can be done, and this is why in the New Testament it says that if an individual purposes in his heart. Well, basically you might say that there is a standard set of 10% that carries over from the Old Testament, which is obviously what God expected at that time. And since God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, we can anticipate that that's basically what He expects today. But then we have to determine in our own process how we have been blessed and how much it is that we're going to contribute. And so, the old expression that you've heard me use before, people go to the grocery store and they say $1 looks like a postage stamp, and that's about right today. But if you go to the church building, it looks like a bedspread. And unfortunately, people tend to think about this from the standpoint of actual dollars and cents. But that's not it. If If 10% of what you have to offer the Lord is a dime, then that's what he expects. And if you want to offer more than that, it's as you purpose. As you have been blessed, then he expects you to demonstrate your thankfulness to him in the way that you do this. And it's really not anything different than anything we've ever heard before. So giving is a subject that is spoken of, as we say, more than almost any other single subject in the entire Bible, Old Testament and New. It's there over and over and over again about giving. But Cain learned the hard way by not doing what God had indicated he should do. Cain tried to do something different than what God wanted, and there was a consequence. And as we said before, with God, there is no political correctness. With God, he says what he wants, and then it's up to us to do what he asks. If we choose to do it our way, then the consequences are there, and we have to deal with it. So the tithe would seem to be God's basic standard based on what we have. And that way it balances out. It's rather than setting a level and saying, you got a lot, so you got to give a lot, or anything of this nature. No, God says based on percentage of what you have, what I've given you, what you have to use, then that's what I expect from you. And so it's a choice that we have to make. So since everything that we have comes from God, we really can't afford to be too chintzy with him and start saying, well, you know, I really can't afford to give that much because it costs me that much to live. But I'll let you know a secret, one that you've heard from other preachers, I'm sure. You can't outgive God. The more you give to him, the more he'll bless you. And if you don't believe that's true, you just try it. You try to outgive God, and you'll discover you can't do it. Because everything is his, and he finds a way to bless us and to care for us because he loves us. He sent his son to die for us. And I don't know of any greater way that he could possibly have shown his care and concern for us. And so think about these things. I'm sure that a lot of this is new to you. You haven't heard that before. That's fine. But you need to think about it because this is what's in the book. And what's in the book is what's important. And of course, if you are not a member of the body of Christ, we want you to have that opportunity and offer the invitation as we normally do. Or if you needed a prayer of the church on your behalf, we are willing to pray with you as well. So if you're subject to the Lord's invitation, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.